Now, I don't know what the kind of mental stamina is of everybody, what you're prepared to start embarking on. What I would like to say is that the intention from now on is that we have got on the agenda a very perhaps short, if you wish it, discussion, which will be perhaps transferred or developed to the 10 o'clock session tomorrow morning, 9:45 before 10, and after which we will then be discussing in two different workshops a series of issues. Some of these items will be presented to you again in a very partial and abbreviated way, and that will go on as a large discussion day tomorrow. Now, what Nika is doing now is just handing out to you the program for tomorrow. This is, I think, as up to date as we can get it. What I would like to ask you now is whether you would wish to address. We have a number of our speakers, not quite all. I think Paul Hurst and Joan Gould are not here. I think we have the others. If you would like to address them with any immediate questions that really you feel you would like to ask now, we would be delighted to try our best to respond. Ken.
Could Julian Roberts say something about Leotard's use of Kant? He's very much a tenant of. I just wonder what you think.
Julian, did you hear that?
Leotard is very heavily reliant on Kant. And what do you think is happening with his use of Kant?
Sorry? Leotard
is embedded in Kant. I just wonder what you think.
What's on the Sublime?
The idea, the number of. What is the attitude about his employment?
Well, I think Leotard is. Well, I like Leotard's reading of Sublime, but I think he's wrong with it. Where Leotard tries to use the notion of the Sublime to sort of de-Kantianize Kant, which I think is wrong. I mean, he tries to use the notion of the Sublime as a way of kind of taking Kant off his hinges. I mean, I'm sort of getting round behind what he obviously feels is Kant's excessive rationalism. But I really have to think about that.
Well, I was wondering
It's in his very, very, very newest book, isn't it?
no, I think he is confident in as a notion of the idea.
He also addresses it with reasonable present. Did you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Julian's probably right, except that it makes it sound like a very voluntarist thing that you kind of thinks Kant unhinges him. As if I would say that putting some pressure on the notion of judgment in Kant, which is the problem of the third critique, which is supposed to tie the, to bridge the gap, the gulf between the other two. That putting some pressure on the question of judgment will produce the unhinging of Kant from within Kant. It's not an attempt to sort of go at it with a screwdriver.
Oh, yes, no, I wouldn't deny that. But I mean, all I say is that also going from Kant, within Kant, I'm not sure he's actually right.
No, I mean, the only thing I think was sort of to point that question that in your presentation it made it sound as if, Kant sort of set up a framework and then Hegel came and said, how it could change, and the two sort of went together quite happily. Whereas for the other, Kant and Hegel are actually in a certain amount of friction.
All right, yes, I know. All right, I know. I mean, as far as all these people are concerned, Hegel is a degeneration. I mean, he's not the right reader of Kant at all, and Hegel is bracketed with Leibniz as a sort of appalling kind of monolithic super rationalist, whereas Kant is something much more subtle. I think that's wrong, basically. I mean, I can understand, I think it's a nice reading of German idealism, but I just think it's wrong. I mean, this, I suppose, is a difference. So, no, that's right. I mean, nowadays, if you read Kant, you either read Kant as somebody who goes into Hegel, or you read Kant as someone who goes into Kierkegaard, I suppose. I mean, or everybody else. I mean, the French read Kant as a not as a Hegelian, which is, I mean, it's interesting to the extent that it generates a lot of very important questions, but I think it's wrong.
Anyone else like to raise a question to one of the speakers? It's a bit weird. People can't imagine why.
I was wondering if we could
Try that, yeah.
question this morning about the difference between anthropological relativism and epistemological relativism, and I was wondering if anyone could undertake how to imagine transferring that distinction to specific questions of architecture.
Can you come just here, because you're around the corner?
Just wondering about the transferal, possible transferal of the distinction of epistemological relativism and anthropological relativism to architecture. It's possible to imagine, see what anthropological relativism might mean in architecture, in the sense one saw it in the 19th century, question of style. But what would the crisis of epistemological rationalism and relativism translate into as an architectural agenda?
Now, who would care to examine that? I mean, I think one of the questions that we're going to be, one of the great deficiencies that we all have to very seriously acknowledge are any sophisticated set of theoretical constructs which actually examine architectural thought. And not only architectural thought, but the complex relationship between thought and production, and thought and the actual product itself. And as Stan Anderson talked about, there are these separated domains of semi-autonomous or quasi-autonomous. There are these areas that have their own logic, which have their own rules. And I think that in the kind of present stage of the examination, I think that this is now more a question on the agenda than it is something of which there are very, very clear-cut answers. And certainly, in my view, epistemological relativism can be highly connected with the theoretical constructional world, that is all those ideas that come to produce architecture. But anthropological relativism somehow has a form of bodies of belief. It also has another relationship, as a different sort of relationship, certainly in terms of well, to me, in cases of what is going on in architecture today with the many movements, whether in fact they can talk to each other or not. These kind of questions, I think, get raised, and are very approximately similar to the anthropology of relativism. I mean, that's a sort of very approximate, but I think it's a much bigger thing. And also, I would say something that is rather crudely characterized up to now, and really deserves much more attention than it's had. This is what we hope maybe we're going to do something about this in our subsequent discussions tomorrow. But sorry, Mark. Geometry speak, sorry.
I think one thing that the kind of question raises is in a sense, the question of what is the status of the identity of certain objects. For example, one could ask the question, do all cultures have architecture? Right? Now, that actually is sort of quite a complicated question, and I think it kind of raises certain issues that Julian talked about in respect to the law. If I could just kind of make a kind of digression via the law and then come back to the issue of anthropological relativism. I think the thing about the law is, obviously, we describe the sort of Kantian schema very clearly, that it is through legal discourse, it is through the categories of law that one can think what you call continuity of entities. Let's also call it like the identity, and it's kind of an enduring identity of entities in the law, given this particular form of the person. And thus it seems that through this kind of Roman law kind of concept, one can imagine this artificial world in which entities endure, kind of subsist. Now, I think that the problem kind of with that, and I think it's a problem which exercises a lot of contemporary thought, but perhaps in a rather unstated way, is really here about the status of law. And what it seems to me that Kantian account of law overlooks is the kind of arbitrary and tyrannical character of law. Your account of Kant's account of law is a world in which objects exist by being recognized by the law, but that then kind of all constitutes the legal world. I think that's quite a legal way of looking. It makes the law sound kind of extremely benign and extremely judicious. Now, if one just takes even the very kind of simple questions of legal personality, it's true that objects like limited companies can be legal persons, but only for those purposes and for those actions that the law declares. It doesn't actually say to a limited company, now you're a legal person, as if legal personality is all of the kind. It says you're a legal person for this, and this purpose, but not for that. Limited companies can't get married. The law actually, what often goes under the name of recognizing them as persons, actually is designation. Designation in a rather peremptory fashion, designations that can be rather suddenly kind of withdrawn. It seems to me that puts a different complexion on the issue of how is it that entities exist in their kind of enduring identity. One could say now that their existence is altogether more fragile, altogether more kind of dependent on the arbitrariness of the law. In a sense, they only have an identity by the possibility of being excluded from the law. It is the failure always, even within law, to achieve full personality, because your personality is always dependent upon your seeking the goodwill of the law to continue to recognize you, which means that in fact identity is actually in some sense not something that comes from recognition, but something which you never achieve, and which in a sense, finally, when you come to think what your identity was, it was that you were excluded from a whole series of things. One kind of thinks of Kafka's kind of story of the law. Now, in that sense then, the identity of objects, I think, takes on a character of much more of kind of designation. If I go back to the question like, do all cultures have an architecture? That question only arises like on the back of anthropology. It's anthropology which asks such questions. It asks the question like, do all cultures have X, or do some, or whatever? So that, for example, we wouldn't be able to think, I think, culture unless it had a kinship system. In that sense, in a much more simple sense, and you've been talking about the term kinship system that functions as a kind of transcendental term for analysis. You can't analyze the culture with that. There would be others, categories like royalty, which one would intuitively feel was anachronistic to kind of, immediately get to the Azandi and say, where are their royalty? Architecture would be a complex instance, because by virtue of the definition of some senses, buildings, whatever, in that empirical sense, they would, by definition, empirically would. But insofar as architecture has a more complex definition, right? It's not clear that they would have, or finally they would have, but only by the fact that they had begun to have something which was now referred to as architecture. And I'm trying to sort of bring the question back into what Julian was saying, to tip issues from like recognition to issues of like designation, in which I think the status of the existence of objects and how it is that objects exist is actually much more precarious. But that precariousness doesn't involve kind of naturalizing it again.
Can I just answer that? Can I? I mean, that's absolutely right. And I wasn't in any way suggesting that the sort of legalistic model is all there is to it at all. I mean, I was merely putting that forward as a way of trying to explain what I thought Kierkegaard was doing. I don't think that's what Kant's about, or only in a sort of preliminary sense. I mean, the whole point about German idealism and the sort of forward-looking aspect of German idealism is the notion of reflection. That is to say, reflecting upon the fact that there is law and it's inadequate, but it doesn't cover everything. In other words, it's very much open to radical transformation. But how it does it is quite different from the way that Kierkegaard. I mean, Kierkegaard and followers say, smash the law completely, and that's the only way in which we'll be free. Kant and Hegel and I think Marx say, reflect in the right way on the law, in the sort of peculiar sense of reflection, and then there will be a transformation, but it will be, well, anyway.
Would there not be, sorry.
I have a question with respect to the strategy of repetition you offered as a means to overcome the coercion of intellectual constructs. How would that work?
And it's a repetition purely because it's an event which happens at a natural time, as to say at the winter, whatever it is, solstice or equinox. Solstice. And it's not, in that sense, it sees itself as completely non-artificial, I would think. I mean, a repetition is a celebration of non-artificial things. I mean, they may not necessarily be quite as sort of crudely natural as say Christmas, but the repetition of feast days is a fundamental mythic act. And I think that's what underlies the notion of repetition, even in such sophisticated thinkers as Kierkegaard and Deleuze and whoever. But, I mean, you say, how does it avoid being artificial? Well, I don't know that it does. I mean, I wouldn't seek to defend it. I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that it's not particularly intellectual or intellectualist. Don't you? I mean...
Well, I think it may have been fortunate or unfortunate that you brought into the discussion a German situation when it was about to become totally unbearable, because it seemed to me that you used Heidegger as the other example for appealing to repetition, that in the case of the Germans it was ended up in total disaster, it ended up in another coercion.
Yes, yes, oh, I completely agree. I mean, for me, you know, the point, for me, Heidegger is the tragedy of refusing to take political responsibility. I mean, refusing to face up to the fact that we inevitably live in an artificial world, and you have to resign yourself to that. I mean, there's no point in talking about a kind of radical break, because it just ends up in, as you say, more coercion and a different kind of artificiality. And that's what is so silly about Heidegger, and that's what's so childish about Heidegger's behaviour in 1933 when the Nazis took over. I mean, Heidegger is just a child in that, when that happens, I think. I mean, you know, regardless of anything else.
Sorry, I just want to say about your use of Heidegger that presumably you want to make some distinction between the fact that Heidegger behaved rather oddly in 1933 and other times. That wouldn't necessarily support your, seems to me, rather hasty derivation of a naturalism through into some sort of politically regrettable or despicable features of Heidegger. It's not necessarily true that his actions in 1933 flowed from his positions in 1927, nor even that in 1927. It seems a very odd thing to call it a naturalist. I had a feeling that you had an opposition going between the artificial and whatever didn't like that you had to call the natural. I mean, I can see that in Heidegger there are sorts of
Heidegger would call himself
and so on, but you seem to want to generalise that way beyond into all his offshoots and so on, where it starts, seems to me to be rather difficult to do.
Well, I didn't mean naturalism in a sort of technical sense. I mean, I don't think Heidegger is a sort of Humean or anything like that. I mean, this is just a sort of terminological glitch.
I'm not sure that Heidegger's attitude to technology is quite such a simple rejecting thing of anything as sound technology is actually quite complicated.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to sort of raise that as a...
No, I mean, okay, I'm afraid I was sort of throwing mud around it. In rather cavalier
The reason I tried to return to thinking about anthropological relativism is that with architecture, the problem of relativism presses very urgently because the sheer visibility of contiguous buildings, that relativism in architecture expresses itself as contiguous difference. It's okay to be generous and liberal about the Zandi when they're living in Zandi land. At the point when somebody puts a Zandi building next to one of your own buildings, then integrity, or if you like, the priority of the collectivity of the city, as previously understood, is then compromised. And that's a problem in architecture. That's why I just thought that architecture has a kind of initial bias or sort of conditioned in something like this principle of priority of collectivity. That in fact, that the moment of the new that is particularly impossible in architecture. It's okay to be an expressionist painter or a poet, but it's considerably more difficult to be an expressionist architect.
Now, we wish to continue the discussion. First thing tomorrow. Can I assume that maybe some of us, at any rate, are ready to stop the day? Thank you.